have our Ramsey County staff here today. Thanks for joining. We also have some of our neighboring counties and other counties in the state joining us, a few of them as well. So welcome to everyone. I'm Autumn from Ramsey County, and I'm really just the host today, trying to manage the technology with the help of Bridget and Jeff from Ramsey County. So shout out to them for helping out. Without further ado, I will turn it over to the presenters. Their names and titles are on the screen, but to do a short intro, Amy, Tara, and Missy, welcome. And if you guys want to just do a short introduction, who you are, and then we'll get started.
All right, Amy, why don't you go ahead?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Hopefully you'll learn something about these new guidelines that we're going to be going through. As my title indicates there, Assistant Ramsey County Attorney retired. I think November 1st is going to be that official really done date. But I'm also a CPA, and the people who have been at Ramsey County know that I was hired specifically to come in and look at self-employed cases, and ended up anything that having to do with numbers came my way, including this.
And I'm Tara Borton. I'm a staff attorney at the State Child Support Division, and I am working on implementing this project.
And I am Melissa Rosso. I'm the Deputy Child Support Magistrate Manager for the Minnesota courts. And prior to that, I was here as the Director of Human Services Legal, and also an Assistant County Attorney a long time ago assigned to child support. We're really glad to see so many people joining us today, and appreciate that you invited us to come and share this information. I just am going to say the session today is not just about the numbers and how to work with the numbers, but a little bit about the history and the philosophy behind the changes as well. There will be time for questions at the end, and so please make sure that you're putting those in chat so that we can get to those. So this is a roadmap for the presentation today. Amy's going to talk about the philosophy of the updates and summarize some of those updates. She's also going to talk about some examples, and as I said, we have had some frequently asked questions as we've been talking about this that we will talk about, and then have time for your questions too. Just to give you just a tiny little bit of background, there was a task force that met for about 2.5 years. There was 29 meetings. Each one of those meetings were at least a half a day, if not a full day, where a diverse group of people sat around and talked about how to improve the guidelines. Each one of those meetings, with the exception of maybe just a couple, also had members of the public come and talk about their feelings and ideas about the guidelines. And then we had some sessions that were specifically meant just to hear from the public as well. And I will say the three of us were at most of those. We learned a lot from listening to members of the public and some of their ideas. The task force report, if you want to see it, is out on the DHS website under child support reports. It's got a whole bunch of stuff in there, some of which was included in the legislation that passed in 2021. Basically, when we didn't see any movement on getting the ideas from the task force into the legislature, our boss, John Choi, said, hey, why don't you go see if someone will author something and go for it. And so Amy and I and several others decided that that would be a great idea. And so during the 2020 and 2021 session, we had a lot of conversations with legislators, and what we'll be talking about today is what passed. So we will go on to the next slide, which is the philosophy of these guidelines updates with Amy.
Thank you. The current table that we have right now has been in place since 2005, and it really needed to be, it was from 2005, started in 2007. It came in with income shares, and as time went on, the table was never changed, and that had a real severe impact on low-income obligors, as the cost of living on the outside world had really been increasing. but it was still the same table that we were looking at. I also, from the beginning, thought that some of the tables were too high. Some of the numbers in the table were too high. Taking my 2007 statute book is filled with percentages and numbers, trying to understand myself what it was that I thought was wrong with the table. For the years, I did almost all of the review mods that came through the Office of Ramsey County Attorney. And in the early days of income shares, a lot of those motions were the first change from the old way of calculated support to the new way of income shares. And my review mod workers were very diligent in looking at this and saying, you know, I don't think this is exactly the way it should be working. These amounts seem too high. And so we started looking at what could we do to make that better. We looked at doing deviations for taxes. We looked at doing deviations when someone had a number of different families and multiple children. So we looked at all those kind of situations and started trying to fix it. By 2010, Ramsey County then started doing tax deviations on even the new cases that were coming out, because it was starting to see the impact of the guidelines not being changed. We wanted to make the guidelines more fair so that people could pay their child support obligation and not get into arrears right off the bat. We also wanted to make sure that we didn't take all of their income above the self-support reserve and leave them nothing for taxes and those kind of things. And that's why we use that tax deviation all the time. I'm operating 2 different computers here at the time, guys, so sorry, I got a little bit slow there. But my significant concerns about the guideline table started me being a part of the CLB guidelines group, and eventually Missy's invited me to present to the task force, the Child Support Guideline Task Force, about what I thought the issues were. The task force was really struggling with how to do this, and they just seemed stalled about the table they had received from the Economist. So I volunteered to draft a new table. Kind of a crazy idea. But I have learned a lot at the task force meetings about the current table. Our current table has a $2,000 low income adjustment. I think most people don't realize that that was not numbers that came from the Economist, but they were something that was created after the fact. In that process, I want to make a smooth transition from our minimum basic support orders up to what was recommended by the Economist. So I ended up creating a new low income adjustment that's up to $6,000 of combined joint income. The intent or the philosophy of the table is to get an order that is affordable and therefore an order that is paid more consistently. And to do that, the state needed to focus on less on reimbursement of public cash assistance placed and more on getting an order that was within the obligor's ability to pay. This part of the table is the piece that I have always complained about. So this shows the old number is crossed out and the new number is what's there. This is coming right from our legislation thing, and so it's a little bit hard to read. You can't see the other ones, but it shows all the changes that we did to the table. This is the line on the table that I have been complaining about since 2007. This is where the joint incomes are between 2,000 and 2,099 per month for both parties. So it could be them both having a small amount of income, or it could be just one person having income. Under the old table, if the obligor is the only one that had income, basic support would have been set at $516. Well, not in Ramsey County because we would have deviated for taxes, but according to the table, it would have been $516. The new number is going to be $170. And the reason the obligor has the only income is most likely because the custodial parent is on cash assistance. And so the state is foregoing some reimbursement for that cash assistance by doing these numbers. What I want to point out is when you go further down the table, and unfortunately on my screen, we're showing there, but maybe you can see it. If you get way over to the right-hand side of your screen, it shows what the number is for 6 children. And the number for 6 children for support was $1,498 out of a $2,000 income. So I actually had this case early on my review months. It was a man who was a trucker. He had 6 kids, and the table was saying we should be asking for $1,400. Now, I know that the self-support reserve kicked in and dropped it down, but it still then left nothing available. There's going to be another presentation that we're going to be doing at MSFRC. That we're missing. I talk about more about the details, and in that one, there'll be more information about how the multiple children piece got a little bit out of whack in the current table. But that is something that I believe that we have fixed. One of the things I did when I wrote the new table is I changed the minimum basic support amounts. Now they're just now going up by an incremental $10 for each child. No one at the task force asked me to do that. Frankly, it made the math a little bit easier when I did the table. But one of the reasons I did it is because I would go to court and the custodial parent would have an order for 1 child, and I would be adding a second, and the order wouldn't change. And they're like, I know the order is gonna be low, but really I get nothing else for the second kid. So it seemed like a good thing to add a little bit more for each child up to we kept the level of 6 that was in there before. We don't go up more than 6. Okay, this is kind of an odd little piece that is in the new statute. Because I brought the numbers down so low, if the obligee is first on cash assistance and then now gets a job, they could end up in a situation where if they went back to court, support would go up. And that's because the support numbers up to 2,000 are really quite low as a percentage of income. When I start the table at $1,300 per month, it's about 4% of gross income at $1,300. And as I indicated, the low income adjustment goes up to 6,000, and it maxes out at 16.5% of gross income at 6,000. You got to say that's quite a contrast between our current table, which is at 25% for 1 child at 2,000. But the result of this is if the CP's income changes after the parties have been gotten the order, they could come back to court if there were no other changes and get an increase. And you'll see this in the examples later, but we did this. This would not be an automatic increase. Someone would have to go back to court to ask for that. And because we're an income share state, the people advocating for obligors did not agree under any circumstance that an obligor's support should increase just because the obligee's income had increased. So they wanted this deviation added, and as part of the legislative process, that's what happened.
So I'm going to talk about a new aspect of the non-joint child deduction. Right now, as the law stands before January 1st, 2023, there is a non-joint child deduction for either one of the parents who has a child living in their home. There's a behind the scenes calculation relating to the guidelines for that parent. There's also a deduction that if there's a court order for child support, that court order is deducted from the parent's income. But one of the things that we heard a lot from members of the public and discussions at the task force was, what about those families that haven't gone to court? They have a legally recognized child, and they just haven't had to go to court to get a support order or a custody order or something like that. And so there are children who the parent has been supporting but doesn't have a court order for child support. and also does not have that child living in the home. So we talked about that at the task force, and we came up with a new non-joint child deduction that considers that child who is not living in the home. One of the things that we talked about is, does somebody need to prove that they have a legal relationship with the child? And where we landed at the task force is it would basically be the same proof for the child who's living in the home. So if there's a recognition of parenthood, and that is what would be requested to prove the legal relationship for the child living in the home, that's what would be used to prove the relationship here. There may be times where this information comes up at the hearing. Nobody knew about this prior to the hearing, it comes up there. So there may not be that physical proof of a recognition of parentage or a divorce decree or whatever it is, but the record could be left open for that proof. It also could be taken care of through an agreement or testimony. And so it's really no different than proving that legal relationship that the parent has when the child is living in the home. Can you go to the next slide, Amy? Who is a legally recognized non-joint child? It's a child where there's a rope signed and filed, a child born of the marriage, an adopted child, but really it's easier to say who's not. It's not a stepchild, it's not a child of the significant other that they're living with, where there's no biological relationship. How I really want people to think about this is treat this exactly the same as the child who's living in the home with the parent. It's just that the child isn't living in the home with the parent. So however you would handle that. So this is something that will be also built into the calculator, and you'll see both the legally recognized living in the home and the legally recognized not living in the home in one of the areas on the worksheet. So that's the new aspect of the non-joint child deduction.
Okay, we're gonna come back to me for one of the examples that we've used in another presentation. But this is the one that kind of hits on the spot where we're starting with $2,000 a month of income of the obligor. And we'll look at some different circumstances, what happens under the old, what happens under the new. So as you know, under the current guidelines, if the obligor was making just over $2,000 a month, support, like I said, in Ramsey County would probably be less because we would have deviated for taxes, but $516 would be the guideline support amount. Under the new table, it's going to be $170. So now what happens if both parties have income? So this is one of the circumstances. Under the old guidelines, the support would decrease as both parties have income and they're sharing the expense of the child. In this example, under the new guidelines, support would actually go up. And this is the reason that deviation was created. If the custodial parent went on to have income, you could look at whether or not that deviation should really go through. But for all intents and purposes, if the custodial parent is now working, there's going to be other issues that are going to be coming up. There's going to be medical, there might be childcare, and the situation of it just being the custodial parent coming back to court to say, oh, I can get more money now. That's not going to be likely to happen. The next part of the next one of the example is again, the obligor still earning the $2,078 per month, $12 an hour, and the custodial parent is making $20 an hour. Under the current guidelines, the support would be $318. Now, under the new guidelines, it's going to be $334. I know you've heard me talk over and over again about how the old table looks too high, but there is a portion of the table that is really reflecting the cost of living that has happened over the last 18 years. And it's just in one child, for one child only. It doesn't affect well, it rolls through to the other ones, but all the other ones have had changes the way we've looked at multiple children. So nowhere on the table was multiple children anymore. But this is the one spot, and it starts, the economist gave us a table to look at. Her numbers were higher from the beginning up until 9,400 combined income. Because of that low income adjustment that I created, it's only higher from 5,200 up to 9,400. And it's never more than $93 a month. And that happens at $6,000 per month of combined joint income. If we go up and the custodial parent has even more income, the number under the current guidelines goes down, but so does the amount under the new guidelines. And the reason it's going down is now we're above my low income adjustment numbers for a total income. So we're at 7,000 total income, and the percentage of gross income going to support is starting to decrease. I just do want to point out that even though support is increasing in the second example in this page, it's still less than it would be under the current guidelines. And that's why I thought this was a good result. I think that's all I have on this one. Oh, I just want to tell you, keep this page handy if you've got it in a handout or something, because we are going to get to more questions about what happens next, and it might be handy to have it. So this is going to be the fun part of the presentation, because we want to know if you do have questions about what's going to be happening. You can put them in the chat and we'll look through them near the end and get to them and discuss them. And we hope we will hear from you. One of the first questions that we've heard before is, will all child support orders decrease or will they all change? The first thing you got to know, it's only going to change if somebody goes back to court. This is not anything that's going to start automatically. We're not going to go through and routinely find all the cases that it applies to and do them. So it can change. It will have to meet a standard. Change of law in Minnesota is considered to be a change if it meets a standard. It has to change over 20% and $75. Now, there are situations where, as I showed you in those examples, where support would go up and somewhere they might go down. But I can't find one that, you know, when you look at that example, and I'm just going to zip back to that a minute. If someone came in and the support was at $322 because the CPA had been making $12 an hour, and now she gets a new job and she's making $20 per hour. In that instance, that's going to be not going to be enough of a change to impact, to make the change go through. So that's something that you got to remember. It's got to meet the standards and you have to go back to court. The other issue that could happen is, let's say that we have a case where the basic support for the child has been set at $560 per month, and it's somehow being paid regularly. And the obligor could come in and want a reduction, and they could say, but he's paying it. And she could maybe ask for that, the change to be tempered and maybe come in over time. The obligor could say, well, I'm getting all that money now and I need that money. And it would be up to the court to decide whether or not they would want to deviate and not implement the full change. I think I mentioned before, I've tried and I can't find any combination of incomes from the current to the new where support goes up and meets the standards. I thought I would find it if I added enough non-joint children, since we've made changes to all the non-joint children, and now you can look at 6 non-joint children. But it didn't happen. And one of the reasons for that is because when I wrote the table, I changed the increments for how much additional you pay for each additional child. So there'll be more on this in the other presentation that Missy and I do, but basically in the current table, it was 14% for each additional child, 4, 5, and 6. And now those numbers are significantly reduced. So even going up to 6 children doesn't get us to a point where support would go up. Okay. I think this is you.
Do we want to check the chat or do we want to wait on that and check it at the end?
We'll wait.
Okay, yeah. All right. So my favorite thing about this law that was passed is that it's going to make a really big, meaningful change to our clients, and it also doesn't make a huge impact to your workload. It's not really going to change a whole lot about the processes that folks have to do when they do pleadings. The exception being, of course, for the next 3 months, when you guys are going to have some kind of weird times to navigate and you're going to have to take a little bit of extra time with your pleadings. So we're going to talk about that transition period right now. And we're especially going to talk about when to use which guidelines and how to do that. Next slide. So the guidelines are effective on January the 1st, 2023. So that means that the default in law is that anytime that you're setting support or before that time, you should be using the guidelines that are current today. And if you're in court after that time, you would be using the future guidelines. So that's the default in law. The courts don't have a plan to add any additional hearing dates. We're not planning on seeing a ton more mods or hearing these twice or anything like that. So obviously you guys know that one thing that we're looking at when we're looking at the dates that are appropriate is the date the party was served, because that's when child support can start. And then when the court is looking at child support going forward, they're looking at the next first day of the month. So having those in mind is always going to be important. I definitely encourage you, if you're going to be in court, you're sending out pleadings in October, November, to take a look and see if you want to use the new guidelines. But the important thing to remember is that that needs to be pled out. You need to be clear with the parties and the court about what you're trying to do here. So what's this going to look like? If you may have service on December 30th, 2022, obviously we're getting really close to January 2023. That means that your hearing is going to be later in the year, in 2023. You probably want to go ahead and use the new guidelines, but you want to make sure to be very clear what you're saying. And obviously, if you're serving anytime after January the 1st, the new guidelines are the only show in town. So here we've got another scenario. So we've got this transition period where we're looking at whether we're using the 2022 guidelines or the 2023 guidelines. But for the next year, year and a half, it's possible that you might want to ask for retro support, in which case you'll be time traveling back in time, potentially to the old guidelines. So this is another example of where you want to be crystal clear in your pleadings about what you're asking for. So what should you consider? Always with retro support, especially if it's having to do with public assistance, do you even really want it? If it's going to be arrears owed to the state, is that something we're trying to put on this family? I know Ramsey's kind of at the cutting edge of this. I don't even know if Ramsey is doing these on PA going backwards, but it's something you definitely want to consider. If it's not PA, if this is going to be owed to the CP, have that conversation with the CP before you just decide to set retro. They might not even care. This might not be something they want to put on them. And so if you can just avoid doing it at all, that gets you out of the question of which guidelines to use. If you decide you do want to go ahead and set retroactive support, I would recommend you just go in and run it both ways. Obviously, again, the default in law is that for the time that you are setting it, you're going to use those guidelines. So the default, if you were going to do this on February the 3rd of this year, of this upcoming year, you'd be now using for most of that period, the 2022. Go ahead and compare. Does that amount look fair? And if it looks more appropriate to use the new guidelines, because obviously the new guidelines were what the task force thought was appropriate for Minnesota families, you just need to specifically ask the court for that. Okay, so time traveling in Prism, no kids in the DeLorean. What do we mean by that? Normally, and I'm gonna give away the ending here so that if you do not want to hear the details of Prism, this is a good time to go get coffee. The ending of this little talk is that when you go backwards, just use the web calculator. Just forget about Prism. As Missy pointed out, the magistrates are only using the web calculator. It's what they're going to be used to seeing. And then you can forget all of these messy details that I'm about to tell you. So the web calculator is always going to be reliable going backwards. Prism is not. Prism is going to fail both when there's non-joint children, and also what I didn't put on this presentation is when there's a minimum order. So these are places where Prism time travel is no longer going to be appropriate. So if you're trying to use the 2022 guidelines after we go live, which I am telling you for the first time today publicly, October the 6th. Okay, so now let's hope we didn't cause a meteorite to hit DHS. So October 6th, you're going to have access to everything on Prism, and also the web calculator is going live. So after that time, you're going to be wanting to look to the web calculator for 2022. Now I'm going to get in the weeds for the people who want to maybe squeak around and use Prism when they can and why this happens. So Prism is usually very good at going back in time. And by that, I mean that if, for example, these guidelines table, you know, we're going to put a new table in, there's an old table, and Prism can distinguish. If you put in a 2022 date, Prism is going to say, great, I'm going to use the 2022 table. It's going to do the same thing with the self-support reserve. It's going to just pull a correct number from whatever was the number in time. That's because there's tables in Prism, and when it pulls from a table, it can go back in time. What it cannot do is change the way it calculates. So any way that it changes the order of a GOOB calculation, that's something that cannot go back in time. You pick the worksheet and that's what you've got. So you guys might remember with the PEA, we created more worksheets so that you could do that and just select a different worksheet. That isn't going to work here. The programming on that now would have doubled the amount of worksheets, which was too many worksheets on Prism, and that was going to take us like an extra million years to do. So that's the reason why you cannot go back anymore, because even though Prism can time travel as to the tables, any numbers it just plucks from a table, it cannot go back in time as to the way that it calculates. And I'm going to show you where that matters here going forward. So the next slide is going to be what you're going to see when you go to the landing page of the web calculator.
Okay.
Oh, someday you'll see it. If not now, then on October 6th. There we go. Okay. So I know some folks were hoping that you'd be able to just put in a date in the web calculator, and that programming is too tricky. So what you're going to have is you're going to go to your normal landing page, but instead of proceed to the calculator being one option, there's now going to be two options. So if you click on the one option, you're going to get the new. If you click on the old option, you're going to get the old. That old one is going to be frozen in time there for at least 2 years. So that whole time frame of the retro support, you're going to have that option. The new one is the one that will be updated. So for example, we're going to be doing a tax update to the tables. That new one is going to continue to be updated just like it is now. You know, when the self-support changes, it's going to be updated on that one, whereas the old one will be frozen in time. So when you're going to go, you're going to, next month, you're going to send out pleadings. You want to see what you want to ask the court for. You're going to click through and do both of these. You can go to the next page. And here, so obviously this is a snip here from the web calculator, but with Prism, it kind of does the same thing. So I highlighted in blue there the non-joint child with an order. So you can see that it switched the order of where that comes out with these new ones. So that used to be an above the line deduction, and now it's a below the line deduction, same as with the non-joint child deduction. So those are now coming out in a different place. So this is the type of thing that Prism cannot do correctly anymore. It's changing the way that the math happens. Go to the next slide. And here you can see why that matters. And we've changed how the self-support reserve comes out as well. So because of the change in the math, and of course, we also have changes in the amounts here because the table has changed, but it's changed the order that these come out. So these are going to be different in GOOD versus the web calculator. So if you went in on GOOD, you would get an incorrect result going back in time because it's going to be doing those non-joint child deductions out of order and getting the self-support reserve wrong. And then again, what I did not put in the slides, but it is important to know on those low income folks, even if there's no non-joint children, it's going to mess up the minimum order because that is again a sort of way that the lines are lined up. We had 3 lines, now that's 1 line. So it's always going to want that 1 line and it's going to act different on the minimum order. So again, we loop back around. If in doubt, go to the web. But we have another, for those of you that are gluttons for punishment, and you want to use PRISM no matter what, if you can. GOOD is going to be reliable after October 6th for setting support January 1st and later. So always, always, always using the new guidelines, GOOD is going to be good. GOOD is not going to be reliable setting retroactive support with non-joint children. GOOD may not be reliable during the transition period if you want to use the old guidelines and there are non-joint children. And you should know that previous boards might not tie correctly to the new worksheets. And I don't use PRISM, so that is gibberish to me, but I understand that you create this and then you might want to go back and change it. Maybe you're at court or something and they're asking you to run something new and things aren't going to tie. So if you had a previous one, if you want to use those old ones now, you've got a few days, quick before PRISM goes, do it now, and then know that those might not tie correctly after that. So just sum up again for those coming back from their coffee break. Use the web when you're using pre-2023 guidelines. I think the rest of this we've already said. So I'm gonna kick it back to Missy.
All right, so change is good. I'm going to talk a little bit about modifications and how they will work. Amy touched a little bit on it before, but I'll go into a little bit more detail. Next slide, Amy. So when we went from percentage of obligor's income to the income shares model, we had a moratorium on modification. So people could not bring a modification if their reason for the mod was the guidelines had changed. And the thought was that there was going to be just a huge amount of mods and it would shut down the whole system. And we don't know because the moratorium was there. But when we did the parenting expense adjustment change, we had a discussion, are we going to do that moratorium again? And we decided not to because the year following the moratorium on the income shares, there weren't a ton of modifications. Well, it turns out there were not a ton of modifications for the parenting expense adjustment either. So again, in discussing it this time, we decided not to have that moratorium. And so as of January 1st, someone can ask for their modification just based on the change in the guidelines. As Amy had said, there's not going to be an automatic review of all cases. You guys are all in the child support system, so you know that would be impossible to review every single case by January 1st or even in that first year. So the only way this is going to get into court is if someone files a modification. That can be the county based on a request of a party or the county's own review. But again, there's no system in place for every single case to be reviewed to decide whether a modification should happen or not. The 518A.39 subdivision 2J does say that changes in the guidelines is a basis to bring a modification. As Amy had said before, it also has to meet the standards though, which is 20%, $75. And we'll be interested to hear if people are seeing cases where just that piece of it causes a modification to occur, or if it's other things changing too that causes a modification to occur. So we're kind of geeks here and would love to hear that information from you if you're finding those cases. And then there's another provision that if it's a first modification after guidelines change, there can be a limit to that modification for just that first time. And so that is in subdivision 2K that states on the first modification following implementation of amended child support guidelines, the modification of basic support may be limited if the amount of the full variance would create a hardship for either the obligor or the obligee. And basically they define a hardship as someone being on cash public assistance, MFIP or TANF, but there may be other reasons too. And what this really means in English is if it's going to be too much for either the custodial parent or the non-custodial parent, there can be a delay. It could be, we're not going to do this right now, but we're going to have this happen in 6 months. It can be a gradual modification, either if it's up or down. And so that's what they mean by not by having the full variance be limited. So this is just something to keep in mind when you're working on these cases, that if there seems to be a huge amount and someone is saying, oh my gosh, that's really going to hurt, this is something that can happen and can be requested, and the court can order that in some way, shape, or form. So that's what we have on modifications. So now it is time for your questions. And so we'll open up the chat here. Autumn, are you going to ask the questions, or should we just go ahead and read them? All right.
Okay, yeah.
So first question is, we've been accustomed to deviating for taxes. Will the new table make deviating as frequent?
I think that Ramsey County is gonna, well, we still might deviate more than other counties, but we are not gonna have to deviate nearly as much. Because it's in these low income numbers where we've been having to deviate. The new table is gonna make a huge difference.
And also, Ramsey County's standard for deviating is down to the federal poverty guidelines, which is currently $1,133. Why don't we use deviating down to the self-support reserve, which is currently $1,300 as the standard? Who can really live on $1,133? Amy.
Yes, so, I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, we had a specific committee of attorneys where we would meet when someone brings us to a case, we want to deviate to 120% in this particular case. And we did it on a regular basis. We said, oh yeah, this is one that works. So I think you can do that deviation to the self-support reserve for the next 2 months if you're having to set support in 2022 guidelines. Something that's always been available to ask if it makes more sense. And the thing is, in the beginning, back in 2010, when we started deviating, it didn't make as much sense. But as we got further along in this, it is one that makes a lot of sense to deviate to self-support reserve.
All right, next question. So the next question is if we've drafted pleadings using the current guidelines with an effective date in 2023, do we need to amend the pleadings?
I would say yes.
I would say yes as well. If in 2023, the new version of the guidelines table should be used. And so that's why we're so happy that, and keeping all of our fingers and toes crossed, that the October 6th date is, or somewhere around there, is when the new calculator will be available. Because I know the questioner on this lived through this with us back in the going from the percentage of obligors to income shares, where we pretty much just had to shut down production. Because we didn't have the new calculator available, and we were gonna have effective dates after January 1st of that year, and we didn't want to have to amend things, so hold off till October 6th or after to do your plea, and then you won't have to address that.
For all the Ramsey folks online, I will be sending out very detailed instructions on what to do with active cases and pending cases and whatnot, now that we know kind of the date the calculator is going to become available and what to do. So no worries on that. More instructions to come for our internal folks. Thanks.
All right, so the next question is, please clarify the new non-joint child burden to prove the legal relationship. If we're drafting or in a pre-hearing conference, and a party indicates they have a non-joint child not known to us or on the PRISM system, do we need to now ask if to provide proof that they have that legal relationship? I am going to say, talk to your county attorney about this. Know that whatever you're doing now for children living in the home, if that's been working for you, it should work for you in this situation too. But there's always a chance that the other parent will say, I don't believe that, I want proof. And so that's where we're talking about that maybe a record will need to be left open to prove that legal relationship. But maybe Autumn can issue something relating to this as well for all of you in Ramsey County. And the next question.
Well, there is that second part of the sentence. Do we add it to our recommendation and let the court decide? You'll have to ask your county attorney.
Yep.
And Amy is out. She's not volunteering.
Yeah.
Will you be getting a copy of the PowerPoint? Hopefully that will be made available to you. And there's also a handout. And by the way, if you've attended this today and you're going to the MFSRC conference on Monday, you can go to a different session that's offered at the same time as this one, which I think is 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday or somewhere around there. There's 3 different sessions being offered at that time, and you can go to a different one. But as Amy said, we're doing the general one, the basic one that probably a lot of you have already seen, but maybe some of you have not. At 10:30, if you want to dive a little deeper into the philosophy and a little bit more into the examples, come to that 10:30 one. All right, are all current clients being advised of this change that may cause an increase for requests for review? Sarah?
Yeah, so the short answer is no. We're not sending a letter out to everyone or putting anything on MCSO or something to say like, hey, check and see if you're eligible for a modification. We're not trying to do that to you guys. But obviously people, I think, may find out about this. We've had several organizations who are interested in it. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of them kind of publish this to their clientele or, press inquiries, that sort of thing. So the message may get out to certain circles, but we're not kind of going out of our way to encourage people to look for a modification, partly because we don't want to put that on you, and partly because people honestly are really confused about modifications. And what we learned with PEA is they often think that their orders are magically going to change, or that if their order might change for $40, that they should come in and get a modification. So we're not publicizing it in that way to each person.
And I had to use the Google for something to find something on the DHS website. And one of the things it brought me to was a press release about the guidelines changes that was back in 2021. So there is a little bit of information out on the DHS website about this, but nothing that's being pushed out to everybody.
Well, and I just want to add to the comments that Missy had about what happened when the PEA came into effect. And people don't like to go back to court.
What?
They really
People
don't.
don't like to be in
Weird.
court?
So, I mean, I don't think people are going to be rushing to do this, even if it, because, maybe the person's support was set too high to begin with when it was set 4 years ago. but now maybe they make more. And so if they come in, they don't know what's gonna happen. They might, like, oh, it would have been lower 2 years ago, but now it's gonna be the same. So, people don't like to roll the dice with that.
Amy, I'll let you do this one.
And I guess I'm not gonna answer whether they could skip the attorney approval. I think that was what was in place.
So,
I don't know if it has changed.
so the question is for Ramsey County specifically, does a drafter need attorney approval to deviate to the self-support reserve and not federal poverty guideline, or can we skip the attorney approval piece? And I am just gonna say Autumn will likely let you know.
Oh, and there, she says that. Okay,
Yes, thanks.
And thanks to Rachel Nieder for adding this training session to the internal training calendar in Ramsey County. And she will add everyone in attendance today, so they get credit for coming to this training. We have a few more minutes left. If you have any more questions or comments or wonderings about any of this.
I just want to say, I think they've had the best questions we've had in any of our presentations.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I think so too. CLE number for attorneys is in chat. It's 472505. And it is 1 hour, and we're just gonna keep talking so that we get to that 1 hour.
We could ask the question everyone else has had, since it's the question I keep getting.
Oh, yes.
Let's
So the question that we've been getting pretty much every time at the state is a question that is a pre-existing issue. Actually, it doesn't necessarily come up with these guidelines changes, but it's more likely to come up with these changes is if you have a non-joint child and there is an order for $0 on that child, can you give the statutory deduction using the guidelines table? And what my answer has been on that is that there is a legal question here, so you definitely do need to circle back with your county attorney. My read on that is that yes, you can, but we got in a hot debate about it this morning.
We did.
So
And basically, for federal reporting purposes, a $0 order is an order for support. A reserved order, which is also $0, is not an order for support. So for the last 20 plus years, we have been getting $0 orders instead of reserving support so that we would be able to say, yes, we went in and established an order on this case. But since it's $0, that question comes up because in the deductions from income, you have the child support amount deduction and you have the non-joint child deduction. So this person would get $0 for their order for support, or could they get the non-joint child deduction? And I'm betting Autumn's gonna dig into that one and talk to you guys about that as well.
maybe right now.
I will. The attorney group here will discuss. Just for the record, I think I took the opposing view in our heated discussion right before the session. So we'll see where that ends up. But yes, for Ramsey staff, more direction will come, and hopefully maybe we'll discuss it at the CLV and other meetings with our other attorney partners across the state, because it is always nice to be consistent. So.
And there's a sort of layer that you can add to this too, which is what to do with an $11 order that happened because of the parenting expense adjustment. And obviously, if you were to give credit for that, that is a deviation, because clearly an $11 order is an order. So you'd be kind of off-roading at that point, but it might be worth looking at whether you want to deviate to give that statutory deduction from the table in those cases where someone is doing more parenting time. They do have that extra bedroom in their house, and $11 is really not compensating them.
And thanks for bringing up deviations, because don't forget about deviations. If something isn't making sense and it's something that makes sense to the family that is different than what's being popped out on the worksheet, deviations are always available. Just have to come up with a reason for it and present that to the court. So whether you're presenting it in a default or in a court hearing. Don't forget about deviations, even though the guidelines are changing and we shouldn't have to deviate as often. There's still gonna be deviations. So we had a couple more questions popping up. One of them is, if a non-joint child is only in the non-custodial parent's household 50% of the time, do they get that full non-joint child deduction?
Okay, I'm gonna answer that one. I was like, me too. Because here's the thing, I wish that this is something the task force had dealt with. Because I had seen a number of orders through the PEA stuff where it is $11 or $15, and then there's might be a medical issue, and I've seen those. And if we're giving a non-joint child deduction for a child that isn't in their home, and they have an agreement, there's no child support order, and we're giving them that deduction, I would say yes, if we're gonna do this, that we should be giving it for the full deduction. Now, I think until it's more explicit, it would have to be as a deviation.
Mhm. Yep, and I will just kind of add to the policy reason behind that. When you go to the table and you pluck the amount out of the table, that table amount is assuming that person is responsible for half of the expenses of that child.
Yeah.
That's kind of what they were getting at. So, one of the things the task force talked about was, should every order use that statutory amount? Because, that would be another, but I think that you can kind of look at it that way when you're comparing the two too. If you've got a $200 order, but that someone is doing some other heavy lifting, can you take a look at the statutory deduction and see if it's more appropriate? Because that is supposed to be, the policy reason behind that table is that is 50% of that child's care.
And Arlene, I think you're exactly right on that you need to know sometimes the reason for the zero order. If it's incarceration, obviously they're not doing much caretaking for that child,
Right.
so.
But luckily, in most of these cases, it then doesn't matter, whether you're giving
Right.
the non-joint child deduction.
Where the heated debate came into place was, if the other county where the non-custodial parent has an order, has a $0 order, that should have been modified recently or 2 years ago and hasn't been modified and is still a $0 order. And Ramsey County is going in to establish an order. Is it a good thing to just say, well, it's zero there, so they don't get a non-joint child deduction basically? Or should they get a non-joint child deduction based on the current circumstances of that Ramsey County order? So that's where the heated debate went. If someone is still incarcerated, they're not going to have an order, and so that $0 question isn't quite so controversial. But it is good to know the basis of that original.
If it's a zero order, that shouldn't be a zero order.
Right.
Okay. So any other questions? We've gone way past our 10, not wait, yeah, 2 minutes
You
past.
can count on us to
Yes.
chat it through.
Fill the time. All right, well, I would say to the Ramsey County folks, if you have more questions, you've got Amy for a little bit longer before she's officially retired. And Autumn and the attorneys will always be happy to talk about these things and try to get consistency in the county. So your questions are very important as you're coming across things. Thank you for attending today and for your attention and your excellent questions. We really appreciate all of the work that you do to make sure that you get the right size orders for people. And hope to see some of you at MFSRC.
All right, thank you. See who's here.